Hello and welcome back to CFI Helper. Today I'm going to be covering the basic circuit for you. The circuit can often feel overwhelming for students, and that can be because we're usually taught a lot of details before we really understand the structure of the circuit and what its purpose is. In this video, we're stripping it right back to the basics of the circuit: what the circuit is, what each leg is for, and how it all flows together. We are not going to be talking about wind, radio calls, or airport types today, just because there is a lot of information that we can cover in those topics that I think might be a bit of overload for a first video on the circuit. The circuit is kind of like the rules of the road for airplanes around an airport. It's put in place so that we kind of have a predictable way to know where aircraft may be going, and it establishes a sort of flow so that we can operate safely. A helpful way to think about this circuit is kind of like a one-way loop around a city block, right? Everyone is going the same direction, making the same turns, and we're kind of expecting the same flow. The shape will stay the same even if conditions change. In our example here, we're going to look at a standard left-hand circuit. Circuits can be right-hand, but that will be stated, most likely in the CFS. But in our example, we're going to be going over a standard left-hand basic circuit. I'm going to walk through each leg, focusing on what it's for, not exact speeds or power settings. So let's start with our takeoff leg, okay? Our takeoff leg is going to be the leg right after we've lifted off the runway. The point of this leg is basically to take us to 500 feet above aerodrome elevation before we turn onto our next leg. In the takeoff leg, you establish a climb speed, okay? And this climb speed can vary, again, based on what your goals are. For the most part, we aim for VY in training, which gets us to the highest altitude in the shortest amount of time. But maybe you had an obstacle and you want to aim for VX, which is getting you to the highest altitude in the shortest amount of distance. Or maybe it's a hot day and you want better engine cooling, so you're aiming for more of a normal en route climb speed. Basically, the takeoff leg, you're establishing the climb speed that you've chosen for that condition and that day. And in the takeoff leg, we are also planning to turn 90 degrees onto our next leg. So once we've reached this 500 feet above aerodrome elevation, we turn onto our crosswind leg, 90 degrees to the left, in this case because we're doing a standard left-hand circuit. The point of the crosswind leg is basically helping us climb to circuit altitude, which, as you can see over here, is usually 1,000 feet above aerodrome elevation. And when we're in the crosswind, we are also scanning for traffic that may be coming in over here on this leg, because it is quite common to have people joining in on the next leg here. Again, we are going to be turning 90 degrees once we've reached the 1,000 feet above aerodrome elevation. And that takes us onto one of the, I would say, heaviest workload legs is the downwind leg. And there's quite a lot going on in this leg. This leg is basically helping us prepare and plan for our descent. Okay, so in the downwind, you are leveling out and you're setting your power. Okay, so this might be more of like a cruise speed and cruise power setting. And when you're on the downwind, you're also checking that you're the right distance away from the runway. So usually on downwind, you're about half a mile to 1 mile away from the runway. And if you're in a high wing aircraft with struts and you're doing a left-hand circuit, you can kind of gauge this by figuring out if the runway is 2/3 of the way up your wing strut. Also, on the downwind leg, you are doing pre-landing checks. Okay, so again, we're preparing for our descent. You would also make your radio call on the downwind leg of what your intentions are going to be. So as you can see, there is quite a lot happening on the downwind. And in the downwind, because you're planning and preparing for your descent, there are points that you're going to be looking out for. So for example, this is a beam, your touchdown point. And usually when you're a beam, your touchdown point, you're reducing your power setting, you're probably putting down your first notch of flaps, and you're slowing down your aircraft to a slower speed, and you're trimming it out. So this is helping you slow down a bit. That way, once the touchdown point, if you look over your shoulder, is about 45 degrees off your shoulder, you might be putting down your second notch of flaps. Okay, so you slow down your aircraft, you're almost configured, and that way, when you turn on base, it's going to give you more time to focus on planning that descent and coming in safely. And that takes us onto our base leg. The base leg is pretty much taking us from 1,000 feet above aerodrome elevation to 500 feet above aerodrome elevation, which is where we would begin our final leg. Now, your final leg, you're really trying to focus on coming in stabilized and safely. Your final leg is pretty much taking you to touchdown. On final, you've established your approach speed, and again, dependent on weather conditions, maybe you've put down your last notch of flaps in this situation. And something really important to remember for when you're establishing on final is that pitch controls your airspeed and power controls your rate of descent. And this is really important because when you're on final, you want to get down safely. You don't want to be playing around with your pitch and power so much that you're losing focus. So you want to make sure that you've trimmed your aircraft out to the proper speed and that you have established the rate of descent that will safely bring you down to the ground. Now, yes, you may need to occasionally change things up a little bit, but if you know the relationship between these two, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to understand and fix in a shorter amount of time. And something I also wanted to talk about on the runway is your touchdown point. Something that I personally used to struggle with, and that can be a common problem for students, is knowing that if you want to touch down at a certain point, so let's say these are our 500-foot markers and we want to touch down at the 500-foot markers, we're not going to aim for the 500-foot markers. And that's because, well, when you're coming into land, do you just slam right into the ground? Hopefully not. Usually we level out and flare, right? So because of that level out and flare, you might float a little bit. So if you aim specifically for your touchdown point, you might level out and flare and touch down after that. So it's important to give yourself just a little bit of room if you are planning to touch down at a specific point. So maybe you aim for the beginning of the runway. That way, once you've leveled out and flared, you can touch down at your touchdown point. And again, wind can play a factor in that as well. Now, the thing with the circuit is this is kind of a perfect scenario here. Okay, this may not always be the case. You may have traffic over here that you're looking out for. You may be asked to follow traffic that's all the way over here. So you might not be able to turn onto base when you're exactly 45 degrees off your shoulder. But the most important part is understanding where you are in the circuit. You'll be able to adapt to those changing situations as long as you know the basics, and obviously after you've had some practice. Things like wind, like I mentioned before, will also affect the way your airplane looks, like the heading you're on. Maybe to correct for wind, you look like that, right? But the pattern is going to stay the same. What's important is that you understand the legs of the circuit, what their purpose is, and what you're planning to do when you're on those legs. One last thing that I forgot to mention, but that I think is quite important, is looking for landmarks when you're in the circuit. So, for example, if you're on your takeoff leg, maybe there are some buildings here that you usually see. So you can make sure that you're aiming for those. Maybe when you're on your crosswind, you usually see this little lake here, so you can keep a lookout for that. And then maybe on your downwind, this is a really not great picture of a water tower, but maybe there's a water tower that you're keeping a lookout for. And it'll make it a little bit simpler for you to follow and understand where you are in the circuit. So yeah, I hope this video was helpful for you to just go over the basics of what the circuit is. And remember, this stuff comes with practice. Not all your circuits are going to be perfect, but this is just kind of a basic overview of what it should look like. I hope this was helpful for you, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.